The late Benny Hill was a celebrity figure, best known to audiences for his sense of humour. However, it seems that the beloved comedian was never quite as jovial in real life as he was on the screen. In reality, Benny was an insecure entertainer who lived and died alone. In his last days, Benny was so frugal that he refused to buy a new pair of shoes when his old ones fell apart. When he passed away, it took several days for anyone to notice. Join Facts Verse as we explore how Benny Hill lost all humour in his lonely final days. Benny Hill died miserable and alone. When you ask the average audience member to think about Benny Hill, chances are that they think of the jovial figure that graced television screens for so many years on The Benny Hill Show. From the outside looking in, it might have seemed that Benny Hill was having the time of his life. To the public, Benny Hill was a man who spent his days getting chased around by beautifully scantily clad women on the set of his program. To his close friends, Benny Hill was a miserable and lonely soul who lived and died alone. Benny Hill was a man with many odd tendencies, and it seemed that he was never quite comfortable in his own skin. One of the ways that Benny's insecurities manifested the most during his later life was in his spending habits. As most will know, The Benny Hill Show was a major hit across the globe. The success of the unprecedentedly popular comedy program resulted in its titular performer becoming an exceptionally wealthy man. By the end of his life, Benny had millions of dollars at his disposal and could have likely bought anything he wanted to. However, the man apparently couldn't even be pressed to buy a new pair of shoes when his old ones fell apart. Benny was said to have been so frugal during the last years of his life that he would quite literally glue his broken shoes back together instead of buying new ones. It's unclear why exactly the late Benny Hill was so intent on holding on to every last nickel and dime that he'd made over the course of his career in entertainment, but it certainly showed that the late comedian wasn't all there. While Benny Hill's fear of spending money was certainly odd, it wasn't the only debilitating fear that the late comedian suffered from. It seems that the beloved comedic performer was also afraid of intimacy. Audience members who were familiar with the sight of Benny Hill being chased around by the gaggle of beautiful and scantily clad women on his show may have assumed that the comedian was a womanizer who had no trouble getting on with the ladies. However, the truth is that Benny never interacted with the women on his show much when the cameras weren't rolling, and he never had the easiest time finding a love interest in real life. Benny never felt attractive to women. Those close to the late Benny Hill have suggested that the comedian never felt attractive to women. The comedian's wealth likely could have done all the attraction for him, but it seems that there was still something keeping Benny from finding a proper love interest over the course of his life. Benny himself suggested that he got to interact with so many beautiful women on his program that it would have been hard for him to pick just one. The comedian also suggested over the course of his life that he was interested in finding a woman outside of the entertainment industry, with him believing that show business girls were too strong-willed. Those who are familiar with The Benny Hill Show will certainly be familiar with Hill's Angels. Hill's Angels was the name given to the multitude of beautiful and scantily clad women that appeared on the comedy program. At the start of his career, the Hill's Angels helped Benny Hill stand out from his comedic competitors and attract the audience's eyes to the screen. However, nowadays, many feel that the presence of Hill's Angels on the program is uncomfortable to watch. In today's more politically correct times, the sight of a tubby and middle-aged man being chased around by a variety of much younger and more beautiful women is less hilarious than it is both awkward and emblematic of gender disparity. There were few audience members back in the day who didn't assume that Benny Hill was getting it on with at least one or two of the beautiful Hill's Angels. However, sources suggest that the comedian was essentially a celibate figure who never found his true sexuality over the course of his lifetime. If you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to hit the like button to show your support. Also, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to be among the first to know when more Facts Verse videos are on the way. Benny's frugality knew no bounds. Besides the fact that Benny Hill would refuse to buy new clothes towards the end of his life, when the old ones started falling apart, other stories that show how frugal the late comedian became include the fact that he would only go grocery shopping when the items he wanted were on sale. The comedian also allegedly refused to take taxis to his job at the headquarters of the BBC, instead choosing to walk to the building every day to save that extra bit of change. Benny never owned a car over the course of his lifetime, and he also never owned his own home. Instead, the wealthy and widely celebrated comedian spent his lifetime in flats. Benny Hill was only 68 years old when he died. He passed away in 1992, just a few years after the Benny Hill Show had been cancelled. The Benny Hill Show started all the way back in 1955, and it wasn't cancelled until over 30 years later, in 1989. The reason for the Benny Hill Show's cancellation, after so many years, was that producers felt that the show was no longer acceptable in the eyes of the television's increasingly more discerning female audience. While plenty of men may have continued to watch the Benny Hill Show, producers felt that it would cause women to change the channel. Shortly after the cancellation of the Benny Hill Show, more eyes than ever would see the program, as a result of a syndication deal that spanned the globe. Despite the fact that the Benny Hill Show was airing in more parts of the globe than ever around the time of its titular performer's death, the show was no longer airing in Britain. Benny Hill's rise to fame. Benny Hill's 1989 firing dealt a significant blow to the comedic performer, who had already been dealing with insecurity for the majority of his life. Benny Hill was born on January 21st, 1925, in Southampton. At the time of his birth, Benny was given the name of Alfred Hill. Several years later, while entertaining his fellow troops during World War II, Benny would come up with his more famous stage name. Benny Hill's name takes its inspiration from legendary comedian Jack Benny, who was also one of Benny's biggest influences. Young Benny became interested in making people laugh at an incredibly young age, with the boy being labelled a class clown during his childhood years. Benny Hill dropped out of high school as a teenager and began working menial jobs to pay his way. In the back of his mind, Benny had his sights set on becoming a star. He began working as a milkman to pay the bills, before eventually moving on to an entry-level job at a theatre company. After working with the company for long enough, Benny was given his chance to make his debut on the stage as a performer. Benny impressed the audience with his comedic skills, and it wouldn't be long before he was making notable waves in the entertainment industry. Benny Hill served during World War II, and part of his service saw him entertaining his fellow troops. It was during this period where Benny Hill came up with his stage name. It also allowed the performer to garner more attention than ever before. Following Benny's return from the war, the comedic performer began showing up on television. In 1955, he was given his very own program. As established, the Benny Hill Show would last from 1955 all the way until 1989. The show quickly became a big success in its home country, and it became a global success during the 1970s. The 1970s is when the Benny Hill Show really took off, and it's also when the show began airing in America. Sadly, the 1970s would be the last decade where Benny was fully appreciated. Benny's sad final days. Over the course of the 1980s, both Benny Hill and his form of comedy were beginning to age poorly. Benny Hill's health began suffering during the decade, and so did the ratings of his long-running program. This led to the Benny Hill Show's cancellation in 1989 and Benny Hill's death in 1992. Benny Hill would go on to pass away just one day after fellow comedian Frankie Howerd. Both Benny and Frankie passed away from long-standing heart issues. Benny was 68 years old at the time of his death, and Frankie Howerd was 7 years his senior. Benny was mistakenly quoted in the press upon the announcement of Frankie's death, but the quote attributed to Benny actually came from another man who had been a mutual friend of both Benny and Frankie. In actuality, Benny couldn't have given a quote in honor of his fellow comedian because he was dead too. It was several days before anyone noticed that Benny Hill had died, however, because the comedian lived completely alone. Though the Benny Hill Show was an incredibly popular comedy program that lasted for decades, there was nothing funny about the tragedy of its titular star. Now it's time to hear from you. Did you know that Benny Hill was so frugal in his final days that he refused to buy a new pair of shoes, and that he died only a few years after the Benny Hill Show was cancelled? As always, like this video to show your support, and subscribe and hit the notification bell if you'd like to be among the first to know when more Facts Verse videos are on their way.